Welcome to week 9 of our course on wireless security using the textbook Wireless and Mobile Device Security 2nd edition by Jim Doherty for anybody who's dropping by these videos but is not in our class. All right, I want to preface this chapter. First, let's introduce what the chapter is about. It's called Mobile Security, and in a way I don't like that name very much because it implies all mobile devices, which could be laptops and all sorts of things, but really it's talking about phones in this chapter. But I want to preface this by one statement that is not really made clear in our textbook, but is very important. And that is that the greatest threat to mobile phones is the lack of privacy and the tracking ability of the cellular network, not the apps within the computer part of the phone. Now, there are vulnerabilities in the phone. Of course, it's a little mini computer. But really, where the weakness lies in these things is in the cell system. It's in the phone part of the smartphone because it turns out that through the cell system, conversations can be heard, all sorts of eavesdropping can be done, all sorts of tracking can be done and is done. As a matter of fact, our government, the U.S. government, requires that all smartphones have built into them the capability to be hacked by the government. It is a requirement in those phones. And that is primarily done through the cell system, although there are many other ways of eavesdropping and spying on people elsewhere as well. All right, now let's talk about the actual points made in the book. And again, as usual, some of the points in here are going to be very different from the book. I will let you know where those are as we go along. First of all, let's talk about why we say that the apps, the computer part of your smartphone is not really the enemy, even though it sounds like it should be. One is having to do with sandboxing. Both Android and iPhones are built with what we call sandboxing in place so that when you run an app, that app does not have access to other parts of your phone. That is to say, it doesn't have access to your contacts or to your phone itself or to other applications unless you give it specific permission. Now, if you give it specific permission, then of course it does have access to your contact list and that sort of thing. But that sandboxing makes sure that it does not unless you give it specific permission. Because of that, even though some are open source, for example, Android is open source, the operating system code is right there for anybody to see, it's still rather secure. And you see here the rarity of app malware. Actually, a lot of malware exists, but because of this sandboxing feature up here, it never really gets through and bothers anybody. So it turns out that actual compromises are quite rare due to this sandboxing effect. So when it comes down to it, because of that, because we have to give explicit permission, it turns out that the lack of user education is really the biggest security threat. And how is that so? Well, because we have the capability of side-loading apps. That is to say, loading apps through means other than the Play Store, for example, on Android. Communication attacks. If people can send messages to your SMS through your phone number, then of course they can do phishing attacks, or in this case it would be called smishing attacks, through your communications. So through your Wi-Fi, your SMS, your MMS, all of those things, any kind of attack can be performed, usually using some sort of social engineering. Data leakage, the fact that somebody can take their phone to work, use it at work, and then carry that phone outside of the workplace can create some data leakage. Lack of updates. If we don't keep up with the security updates, of course, we have a vulnerability. Social engineering, of course, is the biggest one, and we already mentioned one of the ways that can be done is through communication attacks. So through MMS or SMS or email, for example. All that can be social engineered in order to get you to give permissions that you wouldn't normally give or to give away information you wouldn't normally give away. Weak authentication methods. For example, if you're still just using a PIN with 4 numbers, that is a rather weak method. That means that somebody only has a few thousand attempts and 50% chance that they'll hit it in the first half of those, right? So that is a weak authentication method. If you're using two-factor authentication or fingerprints, biometrics of some sort. That is much better authentication, but it turns out more people than others use very weak authentication methods such as the PIN. The URL link, this is a real problem. On that small screen, when you see a URL, you don't usually see the entire URL because the screen is so small. And that is a good way that people can hide, that the attacker can hide where that URL is actually going, since you can't see the whole thing. And then, of course, rooting and jailbreaking. With Android, we call it rooting. With iOS, we call it jailbreaking. In other words, altering the operating system so you can get around the security methods that are built into the device. So really, all of this has to do with user education. All right, we're going to cut it off here, and we'll pick up in the next video with communication attacks.